Never stopped legislators before. But.
That's right. I just know the time. Don't let facts get in the way.
Well,
hey, 60% of all statistics are made up on the spot.
I don't know if my statistics are right, but I think the general thought is there, So we have Jessica Peters. Thank you for coming, Jessica, and from the Legislative Analyst's Office, and you're presenting us with your report. So why don't you proceed? Thank you.
Thank you, chairs. The sergeant will be passing out in a minute a handout that we prepared for you for this hearing. I think in your background packets you have a couple of other handouts that we presented at the previous hearings of the special session committees. And so that might be helpful background information for you. If you have questions on that, I'm happy to answer it. But I think we're going to focus our comments today on this new presentation that we prepared for you. Really what we're doing here is comparing at a really high level the various proposals that are before the legislature in the special session. So on page 1 of the handout, we just have some background information to put some context to what you're looking at here. As you can see in the pie chart, about a quarter of all of the revenues that are generated in the state of California for transportation come from the state. About half are coming from local governments and about a quarter are coming from the federal government. And so the proposals that you're considering are really how to change or increase that 1/4 wedge of the pie that represents the state's revenues. Page 2 of the handout, this is a sort of modified version of a chart we presented to you at one of the prior hearings. And this really just summarizes the different revenue sources that the state currently has that are used for transportation, what the allowable uses are or the restrictions under the Constitution, and then how those funds are currently being used. So for example, at the top of the chart, the state has gasoline and diesel excise taxes. Those are restricted under Section 2 of the Constitution, and they're currently used for the Highway Maintenance Program, the State Highway Operation Protection or SHOP program, the STIP, Local Streets and Roads, as well as the administration of Caltrans. The state also has vehicle registration fees, which currently support the Department of Motor Vehicles and CHP. However, under Article 19, Section 3 of the Constitution, those can be used for transportation projects or highway and road programs, which is the focus of this session. The state also has vehicle weight fees, which are governed under the same section of the Constitution as the registration fees. As you've heard already, those are used for the debt service on transportation bonds. And then recently with the cap and trade auction revenues is a new source of funding for transportation. Cap and trade auction revenues fund a variety of programs. We list here just the ones that relate to transportation. That's not a complete list of everything funded from cap and trade. And as was mentioned before, those cap and trade revenues currently are focused on transit operations and transit and intercity rail capital programs. We wanted to highlight some of the funding challenges. I know there's a lot of interest from the committee in trying to establish what the need is. Secretary Kelly talked a little bit about the need for the SHOP program, which is really the state's program for really rebuilding parts of our state highway system once they've sort of fallen into such a state of disrepair that they can't be just simply maintained, but they really need to be completely rebuilt. And I think in your next panel, you'll hear from some different stakeholders about what the needs are on the local system or as well as other things. So we wanted to focus a little bit on what the need is for highway maintenance. And this is actually a different program than the SHOP program that was mentioned. This is what I think a lot of the members have actually been talking about in terms of cost-effective maintenance. And going in, filling potholes, sealing cracks, doing that light maintenance work, which is much more cost effective and done routinely rather than kind of major reconstruction and rebuilding. Caltrans currently estimates in order to meet best practices of going in and doing maintenance on a section of highway every 5 to 7 years, they estimate that that would cost about $1 billion annually beyond the current funding that the department allocates to this to these activities. And that would be to fully fund the preventive and minor corrective maintenance on pavements, bridges, and culverts, which I think you heard from Secretary Kelly are one of the focuses of the administration as well. And so we just wanted to point that out to you. That's one of the areas where it's easier to establish a really clearly defined need if you're looking at what are the best practices for maintaining our highways. So the remainder of the handout, we have 3 different charts that your staff has asked us to prepare. And these charts really, what they're doing is comparing each of the major funding proposals and trying to focus in on the 3 kind of major categories of questions that the legislature will have to answer in this special session. First, where does the money come from? What revenues, new taxes, existing revenues? The second being how to spend those funds, and then the third being other efficiencies or reforms or other proposals. And so on each of these charts, we summarize the different packages, and then we have a few comments as well. So page 3 has the first chart comparing the major funding proposals. So you'll see that there's the 4 columns representing the 4 packages. These are the ones that we were asked by committee staff or caucus staff to discuss. This isn't an exhaustive list of every bill that was introduced in the special session. We have, as you can see in the chart, there's sort of 3 categories of where money might come from. There's new taxes, there's allocating existing revenues that aren't currently used for transportation, but redirecting them to transportation. And then there's certain one-time fundings through the repayment of various loans that have been taken over the years from transportation accounts. We would just like to note that the estimates that we present in the chart are the estimates provided by either the Department of Finance or the committee or caucus staff the proponents of each of the different proposals. These are not LAO estimates. We understand that the committee would like us to do those estimates. That's something that we're working on. I think some of the questions that came up today regarding how you project future fuel consumption, there's a variety of things like that that make it really difficult to actually pull these estimates together. But we understand it's something the committee would like, and we are continuing to work on that. But that's not what's here today. So you can see in the chart that there's a significant increase in funding for transportation from all of the 4 packages, ranging from about $3 billion a year to about $5 billion a year. All of the proposals allocate some existing revenues to transportation, some of them in a few $100 million, some of them in the billions of dollars, reflecting different legislative proposals or priorities. All of the proposals allocate cap and trade auction revenues. Some of the proposals, as you've heard already, allocate weight fees or directly allocate general fund support dollars. We would just know, as has been discussed, that allocating weight fees, reallocating the weight fees, or direct support from the general fund would require budgetary trade-offs on the non-Proposition 98 side of your general fund budget. We'd also like to point out that one of the positives, there's a shift towards vehicle registration fees. There's a lot of concern about uncertainty of fuel tax revenues over time, related to many of the issues that were already discussed with vehicle efficiency, a switch towards alternative vehicles. And so, having some mix of fuel taxes as well as vehicle taxes can lead to a stable and modestly growing revenue source over time. And so that's something you may want to consider in your final package. We'd also note that 2 of the proposals index fuel tax revenues and eliminate the current BOE variable rate setting adjustment process. That process has resulted in some uncertainty and some volatility in transportation funding, and is based on gasoline prices as well as consumption, as well as sort of this rate setting process through the BOE. And that's resulted, for example, in the current year in a 6 cents reduction in one of the tax rates that funds certain transportation programs that was not necessarily planned for. By indexing the fuel taxes instead of using that BOE process, that would likely result in more stable and predictable transportation revenues over the long run. Again, in terms of continuing to work on our own revenue estimates. How much more money that generates compared to the current system is a tougher question to answer just because of so much variability. If you'll turn to page 5 of the handout, we have the second chart, and this just summarizes the various expenditure proposals. We have the same 3 categories in the chart. So the first one is how those new tax revenues would be spent. The second one is proposals on how existing revenues reallocated to transportation would be spent. And then the third is on the expenditure proposals for one-time loan repayments. Some of the comments that we just want to make on this regarding the expenditure proposals. We think that the legislature we recommend fully funding cost-effective maintenance. So as I said before, in terms of looking at what the needs are for your transportation system, Caltrans estimates it would cost about $1 billion to fully fund the proper maintenance of pavement, bridges, and culverts in their highway maintenance program. This is separate from that $6 billion annual need that there's been a lot of attention on in the SHOP program. This is really cost effective. And actually fully funding this program could reduce your future needs for SHOP projects in the billions of dollars annually, because rather than not maintaining our roads and letting them fall into a state of disrepair where they need much more costly reconstruction, the state could actually put more dollars into better maintaining it and defer the need to be fully replacing facilities in the future. And so it's a cost-effective thing that the legislature could do, and it's also going to help you meet your needs in the future by offsetting some of those future costs. And just given sort of how clear-cut that established best practices and needs are and how much it would cost to do it, we would actually just recommend that fully funding that $1 billion. With regard to some of the other needs, I think you'll hear more about those needs assessments later, and it's a little bit harder to pin a specific number on some of those. We also just want to make some comments on the use of cap and trade revenues. So all of the proposals allocate cap and trade auction revenues to increase funding for transportation programs. There's currently legal uncertainty in terms of how the state can spend cap and trade revenues. To eliminate this uncertainty completely, the legislature would need to approve cap and trade with a 2/3 vote as a tax. Absent an action to make this a tax, the legislature could minimize legal risk by targeting cap and trade auction revenues to expenditures that have a closer nexus with a greenhouse gas emission reductions. And so this is just something that you're going to want to consider as you're balancing the various funding sources and how you spend those funds. And the last comment on how to spend the funds is that this may be an opportunity to simplify the distribution of transportation revenues. Some of you may have seen Caltrans' giant chart on how transportation funding is distributed. It is fairly complex, and sometimes that complexity really makes it challenging for the revenues to actually meet what the state's priorities are, especially as revenue sources change over time and as priorities change over time. Some of the proposals before you, for example, the governor's proposal creates sort of yet another system of distributing revenues on top of existing models for how these funds are allocated, and it makes it very complex. And so you may want to consider either distributing the new revenues in the same manner as existing revenues, or thinking about sort of your whole pot of money and are there shifts that you could make there to make sure you're really matching with priorities and maybe simplifying how the funds are going out to avoid some unintended consequences. In the last part of the handout, we just have a summary for you on page 7 of the other major proposals, different efficiencies or accountabilities. There's been a lot of ideas. This is not an exhaustive list, but just some of the major ones that we wanted to highlight. The first one is accountability. The Secretary Kelly talked a little bit about the administration's proposal for accountability. The legislature, 2 of the legislative proposals actually also relate to accountability. And we would just note that the legislative proposals tend to provide a stronger accountability and go further than what the administration does. And that's actually in line with past recommendations that our office has made, particularly in having project level oversight and accountability for the SHOP program, which currently is really lacking in external accountability. And so we've recommended in the past having the Transportation Commission perform this project level oversight and approval functions, as is included in several of the legislative packages. Also, there's proposals related to changing procurement methods, in particular public-private partnerships. We would just note that in the past, the state has experienced some challenges in using P3 procurement. And so if it's something that the legislature chooses to extend this authority, you may want to consider establishing a more robust project selection and approval process to ensure that projects that are procured with this method are really a good fit for it, so that the state is making sure to get the best deal on these contracts as possible. And then lastly, we have just a summary on the other proposals. There was some mention already of CEQA exemptions, as well as the different restrictions or protections on the revenues. So I'm happy to answer any questions.
Okay, open it up for questions from our committee. Senator Cannella.
Thank you for that presentation. It was very informative. But I'm curious, and this you may not have the answer to this question, and if you don't, maybe you can get back to me. But could you articulate how many user fees do we as California drivers pay now? I mean, do you have any idea the number of different fees or the sum total that's collected? Or is there a way to find that out?
In terms of the
just any fees that we pay as drivers. I mean, all the different fees on vehicles.
Sure, we can follow up with you with more information. I think the background is the handout that looks probably pretty similar to this, should have been included in your background packet, where we talk about the current state taxes and fees on fuels and vehicles, and so some of that information's there, but we're happy to follow up.
So if you did that as background, I didn't see it. Is there several? I mean, do you know roughly how many we pay?
Yeah, so just to provide a little bit of context, the state charges 2 excise taxes on gasoline, a base 18 cent, and then the variable rate that was established through the fuel tax swap, currently at 12 cents per gallon. On diesel side, there is an excise tax at 13 cents per gallon. There's also a sales tax that's charged on diesel fuel. And then in terms of, there's registration fees that people pay when they're registering their vehicles. Currently, those are going to support DMV and CHP. There's vehicle weight fees that are charged on sort of the heavier, more commercial trucks that are operating on the state's roadways. And I think in maybe page 2 would help of this handout, kind of summarizing what those different fees are. But if you'd like a different breakdown of...
Yeah. Do you know how we would compare to other states as far as fees that we pay currently as drivers in California?
I know regarding our fuel tax rates, California's fuel tax rates, at least prior to the reduction down to 12 cents, were among the highest in the nation. I'm not exactly sure where we'd be at in the ranking with that 12 cents, but we can get back to you on that. They are on the higher.
And then just to be clear, the administration's proposal for another fee, that's on top of all the other ones. They're not going to swap any out, right? Just be another one added on to all the current ones that we pay, correct?
Essentially, the only one that's sort of swapping it out is replacing the variable tax rate adjustment process through the BOE currently with an indexing.
Chairman Bell's bill, as I recall. So, okay, thank you.
I think when you look at revenues from other states, you ought to look at the total expenditures on transportation and where they get the money for that. Because I think what you see is that California is a state that has a philosophy of the user pays. Am I correct? User-based system of funding transportation. Compared to using general revenues like sales taxes and so forth. Is that correct?
From the state perspective, in terms of the state revenues, typically the state is using more of a user-type fee. The fuel taxes can be thought of that way. In terms of local revenues, the state is authorized. There's local sales tax measures, which are broad-based sales tax. I think other states use a mix. Many states use fuel excise taxes as well. but they also use a
Toll
mix of different
roads,
funding.
those kinds of things are used. Other state revenues, property taxes, other revenues. Assemblyman Obernolte.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Ms. Peters, last year the LAO released a review of staff support costs at Caltrans in which they examined the capital outlay support program there and determined that there were 3,500 redundant full-time positions at Caltrans. Now, I sit on the Budget Subcommittee for Transportation, and we had a hearing earlier this year in which Caltrans vehemently disagreed that there were those redundant positions at Caltrans. And so I wonder if you can bring us up to date on the LAO's current thinking on that topic. Is there money that we can save there?
Yeah, there have not been substantial changes since we released that report in terms of the sort of the size of the program. The 15-16 budget brought the size of that staffing in that program down by about 200 individuals. The thing that has changed significantly since that time is really sort of the context of the situation that you're in right now. When we released that report, our recommendations were based on sort of current law funding and Proposition 1B and some of the other one-time funding sources going away, workload being reduced, and no new money sort of being considered. In the special session, obviously, the legislature is considering how to increase revenues to transportation. And so as you're increasing funding for transportation, depending on how you distribute those dollars, that could increase workload for Caltrans, and they may need some of those people. I think one of the ways to think about it is that if you do increase workload for Caltrans, for example, for the SHOP program, which tends to be pretty staff intensive, the department would have many of those staff resources on board already that they need to deliver projects. If it was the legislature's priority to not increase funding for that program or take a different approach to staffing that program, we do still think that the program is overstaffed, and so it's in the context of having additional funding. There's things that you may want to consider that maybe we didn't address in our report because at that time the legislature wasn't considering additional funding.
I think it would be very useful to know, given the governor's proposal, if that proposal was implemented, how many of those positions would you still consider redundant and how many would be needed to deal with that increase in funding?
That's something that we can continue to look in. I think we haven't calculated the specific numbers. My understanding generally is that the governor's proposal assumes the department is appropriately staffed already, and so wouldn't really capture any of the potential savings that could be there from utilizing staff more efficiently by not having additional staff. But it's something that we can follow up with you on.
That would be useful. Thank you.
Thank you. Others, Assemblywoman Melendez.
Thank you, Chairman Bell. I don't want to beat a dead horse, but to dovetail on that, when the original estimate was 3,500 employees that they were overstaffed by, and you're saying now that depending on how the money is spent, it could increase. Well, they could perhaps make better use of those 3,500 employees. But in the governor's proposal, it also suggests that he is open and willing to contemplate to subcontract more, which means they wouldn't be using those engineers. So the math isn't adding up for me. I don't know that the number's 3,500. It's probably, somewhere in between perhaps. But I'm just wondering, do you have those discussions with the administration staff about how this affects their plan?
Sure. We have had some conversations. We're continuing to evaluate the details of the governor's proposal as well as the other proposals we've been asked to comment on. Our understanding at this time, and if they're here and they want to come up and correct me, our understanding at this time is that under the administration's plan, they would slowly grow the level of state staff by maybe a couple of hundred individuals a year over time, and that they would use a higher level of consultant resources over the next roughly 5 years, because they believe it would take a while to ramp up the state staff to the level that would be needed. And then once those state staff are on board, our understanding is the level of consultants would drop back down again, is how it has been framed to us.
Okay, thank you.
And so I think we're still trying to work with them to see, to what extent their proposal maybe takes into account some of those, overstaffing issues that we identified. On its surface, it doesn't really seem to do that.
Okay, thank you. Assemblymember Gomez.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Quick question on the governor's proposal. It says Caltrans reforms implement cost-saving reforms at Caltrans to generate $1 billion over 10 years or $100 million a year. Do you think it's easily? Can we do it rather easily to get those efficiencies, or is and if so, is there a way to make it greater, the amount, the savings through Caltrans reforms?
Sure. We haven't seen a lot of detail on what goes into that $100 million a year figure, or the $1 billion over 10 years. Our understanding is that it relates to certain project delivery efficiencies, as well as some of the things the administration's proposing on CEQA, and that they wanted to try to capture or score some savings associated with those sort of programmatic changes. In terms of is it achievable, or what level of efficiency is achievable, I think some of the legislative proposals have a much higher sort of level of efficiency that is being sought. 30%. There's some that try to capture this $500 million related to the overstaffing. I think given the issues that we found with some of the staffing inefficiencies in the department, as you're adding new funding, you don't need to add new staff, and that's going to make the department more efficient. And so that there's definitely, $100 million is like, 1% of their budget. It's pretty small. So it's definitely something that there appears to be room to us to make the department more efficient. It's just going to be a matter of what choices and changes the legislature wants to make.
Senator Oliva.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Two observations. One, Senator Cannella, I think you will be excited when you look on page 7 that there are 3 things that Senate Democrats and Senate Republicans agree on. So we are working towards that. We do. We actually do. We are working in that regard. And then the other observation is just that this is obviously very difficult for everyone. It would be wonderful if we could fix our roads and our bridges and keep them going and not raise any revenue whatsoever. But when we look at the gas tax and we think about the purchasing power of the gas tax, just like any purchasing power, it's eroded over the years. And I think that to go forward and think that we we can fix our roads and our highways and maintain them and not raise the gas tax, I just don't know if that's realistic. And I also think a little bit about our roads are a little bit like our house. We buy a house, and in 20 years, in 30 years, we might have to replace the plumbing, or we might have to replace some of the electrical. We might have to do some maintenance to the house. We all use the roads, so it's going to be up to us to fund that, to make sure that we can still use those roads and that they're safe. So those are just a couple observations.
Okay. Autumn Burke.
I just have a question. I know Secretary Kelly said that he hadn't done several different modelings on the gas tax versus the miles driven, and I'm just wondering, will you be providing us any sort of, not just one modeling based on what their concept of what may or may not happen, but maybe the opportunity for us to see several models, 3 or 4 models of maybe if miles traveled stays the same, and we get to a 50% reduction, which is now mandate.
Yeah, that's a good idea.
Yes, that's something that we're continuing to work on. We were asked by committee staff to include LAO estimates of how much revenue would be generated by the various proposals. And for the reasons discussed, that's a fairly complicated endeavor. Something we're continuing to work on. I think the question that's been raised about what do you assume about gasoline consumption is one of those key ones that we really want to spend a lot more time thinking about. The administration does just assume that in their fiscal estimates that gasoline consumption is flat. In the past, gasoline consumption has grown very modestly over time, generally speaking, when we're not in a recession. But the administration is also, we understand, pursuing this policy through the Air Resources Board to significantly reduce petroleum use. And so, it will take us some time to, work with the administration and understand their estimates as well as their policies related to the reduction of petroleum use and how that may affect it. But we are working on getting you some numbers. It may be different scenarios, or it may be just sort of a general sense with, what some of the upside downside potential is.
Yeah, it's complicated because it's also related to congestion. As you have more congestion, it takes you longer to get to some place, and if you have to take longer, you burn more gasoline. So I think there's a lot of factors involved in the fuel consumption issue, vehicle miles traveled, vehicle hours traveled, fuel efficiency, all those factors. But it's very important that we examine if we're going to do a good job in this committee, not, like I said, make the mistakes we made in the past.
Absolutely.
We have to really examine all these things, and I heard my Republican colleagues as well as Democrat colleagues say that that's something that's really a critical kind of job that we have here. I heard that today, so everybody. Okay, thank you very much. Okay, well, we'll now go to our panel. We have some panelists. We have Jim Erb from the California Alliance of Jobs, Lucy Dunn. Lucy's on the CTC as well as the chair of Orange County Business Council. Jennifer Whiting's the League of Cities transportation person. And Kristen Conley from the East Bay Leadership Council, Daniel Himmick from C.C. Myers, and Cesar Diaz from the State Building Construction Trades Council. If you all could find a seat.
We're trying to reduce energy consumption by
I think we'll go in order of the agenda, correct? So we'll start with Jim Erb.